Good to see everyone. Hope you had a good week and semi-week off from class and were able to watch I think all of you have gotten to it, the video from last week. So hopefully that was exciting, but not as exciting as being here in person. Good to see you all. This is what we're covering today, the Abrahamic covenant. These are our four big headings. We probably won't get through all of them. Covenant introduction, covenant ratification, covenant signification, covenant confirmation. This will be perhaps the most Bible heavy, which is good, and less philosophical, theological in terms of new, big, complicated ideas. In fact, the first half of this course, going through the various covenants, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, New Covenant, are more heavy on Bible passages, and then the back half of the class will be exploring some bigger themes. So of course they all run together. Let me pray as we get started. Father in heaven, thank you for your word. Thank you for brothers and sisters here and around the world, in different contexts, sometimes different languages, facing different and often greater pressures and challenges. And you call us together to labor for the sake of the church and the gospel and the glory of Christ. What a privilege we have to be able to gather for these 2 hours and learn. So give us alertness, help us to think your thoughts after you, help us to learn from these biblical texts, whether we've studied them other classes, we grew up in the church and have heard them before, or all of this is new. We want to learn and be stretched and grow that we might not only serve others, but that we would know you better, for that is the ultimate reward in itself. We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. Remember, in the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7 is on God's covenant with man, and it lays out this bi-covenantal structure, that the first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, and then chapter 7:4, now there is a covenant of grace. This covenant of grace, as 7:5 says, is differently administered in the time of the law and in the time of the gospel, but importantly, chapter 7 at the very end of section 6 says there are not two covenants of grace differing in substance, but one and the same under various dispensations. So we are looking at this one covenant of grace, and in some ways, almost all the rest of the class is trying to understand what does it mean to live in this one covenant of grace, and what are the different administrations of it. And so last week, at least on video, you heard about the Noahic covenant, which, as I explained, is an aspect and administration of the covenant of grace, and yet it's quite different than the rest of these covenant administrations, because that was a covenant of preservation, a covenant of common grace, Bavinck called it, rather than a covenant of special redemptive grace. So it's part of the covenant of grace in that it provides the worldwide preservation of the earth so that now God can initiate his plan of salvation. So when we think about the real beginning of the covenant of grace, of course you could trace it all the way back to Genesis 3:15, but we have it now in its fuller flower here with Abraham. So you can see up there on the board our four main headings. So please, hope you have your Bible, turn there to Genesis chapter 12. The Abrahamic covenant is at the heart of the covenant of grace. And here we have the covenant introduction. Genesis 12, 1 through 9. Let me read for you. I would have you all read, but I'm recording this for posterity's sake, and so you might be hard to hear, and I have such a unpleasant voice that I'll read it. Somebody said, I shouldn't say this, I shouldn't put this in your head. But someone said to me a while back, you sound kind of like that guy from Everybody Loves Raymond. I was like, that's not a compliment. I prefer to think of him as the woolly mammoth in the Ice Age movies. Very different. Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of the place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. The very first thing we should notice in this remarkable passage, obviously it's a great covenant passage, a great passage of mission impetus, but we should notice the principle of election at work. You think about it, why Abram? He and his household, we're told in Joshua 24:2, were worshiping the gods beyond the river. They are pagan idolaters. Why not someone else? Later in Genesis, in chapter 14, we'll be introduced to this mysterious character, Melchizedek. Well, he seems like a better option. Why not choose this Melchizedek? Or scholars tell us that probably around the same time as Abraham, even earlier maybe, you have the book of Job. Well, he's a righteous and a blameless man in all the earth. Wouldn't he be a good person to pick and to establish this chosen line? And yet he picks Abram. It's the first time God initiates a scene since chapter 2 when he plants a garden and creates Adam and Eve. So the Lord is up to something of his own planning and purpose. In between chapter 2 and chapter 12, of course, God is operative, but sin is unfolding, or there's genealogies, or he's responding to things. Here we have God's deliberate plan and purpose. Compared to chapters 1 through 11, the action is now slowing down quite a bit and focusing in. I'm sure I've said this in here before, and you learn in your Pentateuch class, but Genesis is comprised of 10 Toledot sections. Toledot is the word translated as genealogy or generations. Now there's 50 chapters in our English Bibles, but the inspired division are 10 Toledots. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth, and then these are the generations of Adam in chapter 5. I think I said that last week. So now we are slowing down, and the generations become much more focused. We've been dealing up to this point with centuries and millennia ranging across the globe. And we're only 1/5 of the way through the book. Now, for the remaining 4/5 of the book, Genesis is centered on one family, 4 generations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's offspring. So that tells you right there the central place that Abraham and his family has in the outworking of salvation. We've had 11 chapters all over the globe and hundreds, thousands of years. Now 4 generations in one family. We start with a command. God tells Abram to leave. That's the first word he speaks to Abram. Leave your country, your people, your father's household. And he lists what he will leave behind, and notice, in increasing intimacy. So he says that you will leave behind your homeland, your relatives, your immediate family, and I will send you to the place, and I will show you where to go. Now, as impressed as we may be, this is amazing. Abraham's leaving. He doesn't know where he's going. The main character is not Abraham. it's God. The focus is not so much on Abraham's faithful response as it is on God's promise. So you look in the first 3 verses, you have the word blessing occurs 5 times. And perhaps it's intentional that the word curse, arar, has occurred 5 times in Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 3:14, 3:17, 4:11, 5:29, 9:25. 5 times in the first 11 chapters we've had the word arar, we've had curse. Of course, it's a lot of cursing by implication, but 5 times the word. And now in these first 3 verses, as if to say, we are matching and going to overpower all of the curse that is at work in the world, and we're going to explode on the scene with this one man and this one family. And he makes to Abram 7 promises, which encompass 3 expanding circles of blessing. So you have Abram, that's 1, and then you have his family, and then you have all the nations. 7 blessings and these 3 expanding circles. Not necessarily in that order, but these are the circles. So he says, I will make you a great nation. So a political unit with a common land, language, and government. Number 2, I will bless you. Blessing in the ancient world usually meant 3 things: prosperity, fertility, victory. So you'll have things, and you'll have a family, and you'll have military conquest, and all of those things are going to come to Abraham: prosperity, fertility, and victory. Of course, what's most important to him is the fertility piece, which is going to be the longest one in coming. Number 3, I will make your name great. Number 4, you will be a blessing. Number 5, I will bless those who bless you. Number 6, him who dishonors you, I will dishonor. So dishonor here is a different, milder word than curse. And then 7, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So there's a progression. Abraham, you'll be blessed. Your name will be used as a blessing. Those who blessed you will be blessed. And eventually all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So most of us have been around the church for some time, and so we're familiar with Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. And so the story doesn't strike us as remarkable as it should, but imagine, I'll just put in my name. You can think of your name. But if God were somehow, we don't quite know how was this, an audible voice, an internal voice. Kevin, follow me. Your family is going to have a seat at the UN Security Council, and I will give you great material wealth. How about Christian McCaffrey's house that's for sale up at Lake Norman? My kids saw that. It was like $12 million. I said, you're going to have to sell some more copies of The Biggest Story, I think. Military success. Your name will be known throughout the whole earth. And this is not just good news for you, Kevin the DeYoungs. You will be an instrument of good times for others. And if anyone is good to you, good things happen to them. Anyone treats you bad, and I will punish them. And Kevin, through you, the entire planet is going to be better off. Wow. That's an amazing promise. Truly world-changing. I'm going to change the world. This is actually a world-changing set of promises. Abram's response is to go. Remember, he doesn't know where he's going, but he knows the Lord promises to bless him. Now, it gets a little tricky to follow the geography. You have to piece together a few different places, but he's already left the cosmopolitan Ur. Abram's family had earlier settled in the well-known city of Haran, north of Israel, in Assyria, travel 500 to 600 miles northwest of Ur to the border of Iraq and Turkey. So then they take this route that the Israelites would later take, and Jacob would take, down into the Promised Land, south to Shechem in the northern part of Israel, then to Bethel, then to the Negeb. And the Lord appeared to him there and said, I will give you this land. Now, if you remember from last week with the Noahic covenant, I made all those parallels and drew from Bruce Waltke between Adam and Noah, that clearly Noah is, now he's not the Christological second Adam, but he is an Adam 2.0. All of creation is decreated, with the waters which were separated being opened so that they're floods, so there's a decreation, the water blows on them. All of the ways we saw that Noah is a second kind of Adam. He too has 3 named sons. He too is going to have a fall. Adam fell by eating. Noah has his sin by drinking. When Adam sins by eating, the result is he sees his nakedness. Noah sins by drinking, and there's his nakedness. So all of those. Well, there are parallels now between Abraham and Noah. See, with so many of these covenant iterations and administrations, God is saying, okay, it's building on each other, and it's saying, okay, we had that Adam, now we got Noah, which is building on that Adam, and another Adam, and now we have Noah, and now this Abraham is the next but better Noah. So for example, God spoke to Noah, chapter 8:15. He came out of the ark, 8:16. He built an altar, 8:20. God blessed Noah, 9:1. He told him to be fruitful and increase. He established a covenant with Noah and his offspring and all living things, 9:9. Noah was 10th from Adam. Abraham is 10th from Noah. So God spoke, so that's Noah in chapter 8 and 9. Now the parallels here, chapter 1, so just God spoke to Noah. Now God speaks to Abram. God said to Noah, get out of the boat. Says to Abraham, get out of your country. Noah got out of the boat. Abraham left his country. What does he do? Just like Noah, when he gets out of the boat, builds an altar. Abram builds an altar. Now, one of the differences, God told Noah, like Adam, be fruitful and multiply. I will bless you. And now he says to Abram, I have blessed you. I will bless you. And notice the command of multiplication, it's not that that's ceased, the professor with 9 kids says, hopefully, but that now God is saying to Abram, different than Noah, be fruitful and multiply, of course, well, that's good. But now he says, I will make you fruitful. I will multiply you. I will make you into a great nation. It's landing the accent now on what God will do unilaterally to bless Abraham. He promised the land to Abraham and to his offspring, and there is a formal covenant to come, just like when Noah gets out of the boat in chapter 8, and then chapter 9 he establishes this covenant. So yes, Abram's response is one of faith and obedience, but Scripture emphasizes something else. Look at verse 7 and 8 again. The Lord appeared to Abram, to your offspring I'll give this land. So he built an altar. Into verse 8, and there he built an altar. Scripture emphasizes here in chapter 12, yes, faith and obedience, but even more, he worships. So little application, maybe the first thing we ought to do when God makes stunning promises is simply say, thank you. Wow. Amazing. And it means here, preachers, sometimes the best application in a sermon is that people's thoughts are so lifted upward that they're drawn to worship God. Now, if you end every single sermon with, and let it let it lift our hearts upward to God. No, that's not going to be very good. But sometimes we think, well, it's not, I haven't really applied the text. If I don't then give them, here's 3 things, 4 things you can do. Notice the application here. What else could Abram do? Well, he obeys, of course, but he worships. God has given to him these great and precious promises. That's why Galatians 3, 8 and 9, Paul says, the scriptures preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. The climactic blessing is for all the people. So, yes, God is showing a particular electing love, and now the plot is focusing on this family, this line that has come from of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It's the line of Shem. That's why the Jews are the Shemites, the Semites, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. So this is the line. Of course, they're not Jews, really, because there's no Judah yet. But they are ethnically what will be called Jews from the line of Shem, now from the line of Abram. So even though God, for most of this book, has his clearest eye upon this family and this ethnic people, yet he never loses sight of the nations, that Abraham is to be a blessing to the nations. One of the things you sometimes hear from Genesis 12, Christopher Wright, for example, in his book on Old Testament theology, makes a big point to say this is the mission blueprint for the church. Well, it certainly is a missionary text because it talks about God's heart for the nations. But what Christopher Wright and sometimes others in the missional conversation mean is this is to be a blessing is what the church is called to do. So some of the Reggie McNeil's from the Baptist, popularizer, a number of these folks have argued this is the Old Testament Great Commission. Go and be a blessing. And so if we are going to be like Genesis chapter 12, your church's mission is to go be a blessing. Okay, so think about that. Well, what's right about that is we're blessing people, yeah. Don't leave here and say, what'd you get out of class? The professor said, stop blessing people. No, that's not the point. But how is it? Because when people give that, they take Genesis 12 as their sort of missionary paradigm. It ends up being, go out into your community and give water bottles to people, or give job training, or give literacy, or give medical care, or help with crop rotations, all of which can be done to adorn the gospel. But is that a proper fulfillment of Genesis 12? Well, not as Paul understands it. Paul in Galatians 3 does not take Genesis 12 and say, oh, you know how then you go out and you do things for human flourishing in your communities and you're lined up with the Abrahamic blessing. No, Paul says, this gospel came, in you shall all the nations be blessed, so that, here's the point, the way that we are to bless the nations as the church is to introduce to them this seed of Abraham so that they too might experience the Abrahamic blessing. So the word blessing, of course, is a good word, but when we just say the church is to go out with a blessing, just go out and bless your community. And that usually means it's sort of good works, human flourishing, help with social concerns. This blessing is the blessing that comes through the promised seed of Abraham. That's how Paul understands it. So if we want to get the missiological imperative from Genesis 12, it would be to go out into all the world and make known the way in which the nations can be blessed. There is no blessing strategy that unfolds in the rest of Genesis. In fact, if any of you have taught through or preached through Genesis, you realize that this is a pretty lousy family. That they lie, and they hook up, and they fight against each other. This is the good side of the tree. That the point of Genesis, not little mini biographies of heroes of the faith, though there are heroic elements, but to show that quite despite himself, Abraham and his family is blessed. In fact, it can be almost uncomfortable preaching through Genesis, because right after this, you see verse 10, the heading, Abram and Sarai in Egypt. And you know what's going to happen? He's going to lie about his, and she's, these Hebrew women, they're in their 80s, and they're still, they're great. They got it, they're great. So there's hope for all of us. And he's got to lie about them. There's 3 times that they have this sister story. Twice with Abram, once with Isaac, lying. And what happens is each time they get blessed, quite despite themselves. It's to show that even when Abram lied, if this Pharaoh or later Abimelech, if he does anything to mistreat Abraham, what happens? His whole family, the wombs get closed in the land. He's going to do terrible things to them, because if you dishonor this man Abraham, woe to you. And if you're good to him, I bless you. So Abraham keeps getting blessed despite himself. It's not a roadmap for how you ought to live your life, but it's a testimony to God's unilateral, absolute plan, no matter what, to bless Abraham and the nations through him. So this is the covenant introduction. Questions before we turn to chapter 15? All right. Chapter 15, covenant ratification. By the time we get to chapter 15, Abram has seen some amazing stuff. So he gets the 7-fold blessing in chapter 12, and then immediately the promise is threatened. So you can go back, the second half of chapter 12, the promise is threatened by famine. And Abraham fails his first test of faith. Instead of trusting God's promise, he flees for Egypt, he lies about his wife, but despite Abram's failings, God's promise stands, and Abram leaves Egypt a wealthy man. So everything else in the rest of the book, all of Abraham's fabulous wealth, started here. Maybe he had some already, but here in Egypt. So first the promise is threatened by famine. Abraham fails the test, but he's still blessed. Then in chapter 13, the promise is threatened by Lot. This time Abram is more honorable. He defers to his younger relative. He gives him the first choice, and Lot chooses foolishly. You have chosen poorly. And everyone, you just imagine Jewish children hearing these stories read, and they've heard them over the years, and when it gets to choose the land, and then Lot looks out and says, I'll choose Sodom. Beautiful, beautiful, just gated community. There it is, Sodom. And everyone would have said, no, Lot. But God gives the promised land into Abraham's possession and promises to make his offspring like the dust of the earth. So threatened by famine, threatened by this family squabble with Lot, and then threatened by the eastern kings in chapter 14. So Lot is taken captive. Abraham gathers 318 of his fighting men. They rescue Lot. They rout the alliance of eastern kings. Once again, God's promise is indestructible. When Abraham came out of Egypt, he was a wealthy man. At the end of this, end of chapter 13, he's given the whole land of Canaan. And now at the end of this scene, he has victory, wealth of several nations beyond the Jordan. So he's already a great nation. And now we see all those who curse him are cursed. You do not want to mess with Abraham. And incidentally, it is what the church in America or the church in China or the church is always going to face different struggles. And yes, we strategize, and yes, we try to be wise and work political angles, but this is ultimately the hope. You may not see it in your lifetime or my lifetime, But whomever curses the offspring of Abraham will be cursed. Whoever blesses will be blessed. You do not want to mess with God's people. Now, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, not ours. But we see here, whoever comes up against Abraham, you just know, not going to go well. In politics, in family, in battle, and everything, Abram is coming out on top. Remember I said blessing, prosperity, military victory, fertility. So everything except the one thing that I'm sure Abraham wanted most. So look at chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, you can almost hear the existential pathos, not only as a man who's wondering about his blessing, but just as a man and a wife who so desperately want a family. He says, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless. And the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. He has every earthly thing. He's been victorious over all these kings. He has unimaginable wealth. And what he feels is, I am childless. Again, there's pastoral preaching points and connection points and how you minister to people, because every one of you will have people like this in your ministry, and there are no doubt people with this pain in this classroom. And it does give us something of the immense pain that Abram feels. I mean, he has every earthly blessing you could possibly want, and yet he comes to God and he says, you haven't given me anything because I don't have a child. He wants a child. He's been promised a child. This is the first time we have record of Abram speaking to God. And he says, I have my servant Eleazar. He is in line to be my heir. But God, I know that's not what you had in mind. And Abram says, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. Verse 4, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. So God is saying, you're right, Abram. That's not the plan. You will have your very own son. In fact, it's one of those scenes that's so familiar that it doesn't hit us like it should. He brought him outside. You ever notice that? I don't know how he did it. Again, a voice, a prompting, something. He's in a tent and he gets this. And God says, I want to show you something. I want to show you. Look. And no doubt more stars than probably most of us have ever seen, because we have, urban lights and everything. But if you've ever been out in the wilderness or someplace far away, it's just these stars. He says, I want to show you that. Look toward the heaven. Number the stars. And you wonder if Abraham, really? Yeah, number them. 1, 2. You can't. You can't number them. So shall your offspring be. I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but this is true. You can look it up. I think it was the University of Hawaii, some researchers, maybe 10 years ago or so, they had researchers. And I don't think they were motivated by some biblical quest, but they set about to determine if there are more stars in the sky or more grains of sand on the earth. It's a very Abrahamic covenant, like probably RTS scientists or something. And they had the whole formula, of what they can see with the Hubble telescope, and then all the light years away, and then they had some way of calculating grains of sand. And sand is very, very small. If you've ever taken a child to the beach, it seems to be there infinite amounts. They determined by quite a long margin there are more stars than there are grains of sand. You go Google it and you can find their methodology, but there are more stars. That's one of the reasons why you can buy a star and name it after your loved one for their birthday for $60 or something, because they're never running out of stars. They are never running out of stars. There's more than anyone could even number. And God promises, so shall your offspring be. Love this line from Gerhardus Voss. He says, God does not begin with working upon the inward physical states of the patriarchs as though they were subjects for reform, an unbiblical attitude which is unfortunately characteristic of too much modern religion. He begins by giving them promises. The keynote is not what Abraham has to do for God, but what God will do for Abraham. Then in response to this, the subjective frame of mind that God changes the inner and outer life is cultivated. So Voss is saying, of course, God does want to change our inner and outer life, but don't start as you minister to people, here's what God's doing to transform you. Well, that is a really important part of the implications of the gospel. Voss says, notice God starts with a dump truck of blessings and promises and who God is. And we have in verse 6, amazingly, after going out and seeing these trillions of stars, which he can't name and number, he believed the Lord. Again, we know that, great gospel verse, and Paul talks about it, but just let it linger there for a minute. Abraham's been around a while now. He's got no child. He's got Eliezer. He's had all these blessings, but he doesn't have the one thing he wants most of all, which is a son of his very own. And God says, come outside, look it, I'm going to give you all of that. And Abraham actually said, you're right. You will do that. He believed, and it was counted to him as righteous. Great text here, even in the Old Testament, of justification by faith alone. There's no merit. We're not justified because faith tips the scale. You got all your bad works, and that counts a lot, but faith counts so much it tips it in the other way. No, all of the reformers were clear in saying faith is the instrumental cause of our justification. It's the means by which the blessing of justification comes to us. It is the straw through which my wife sips her sweet tea. It's the instrument by which the blessing comes. It's credited, hasab, it's the verb, reckoned, counted, to assign a value. And this comes, keep this in mind, because later we're going to have passages about obedience, and God does tell Abraham to do things. But notice this justifying moment comes before circumcision, before sacrificing Isaac, before all of this. He had faith, and God reckoned him to be in a right standing. So that's the first dialogue. And then in chapter 15, go to verse 7. Here's the second. He said, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, laid each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So this is, I call it ratification. You can see I'm trying to get these words that sound the same. This is the formal establishment of the covenant. You could say that verse 7 is the historical prologue. We've learned a lot about covenants from the ancient Near East. Meredith Kline was very instrumental, a couple generations ago in pioneering this study and helping us to see this, that the Hittites and all these, these other ancient Near Eastern people had similar kinds of treaties. They often would start with a historical prologue. So, I am the Lord who did this. Here's some context. Think of Exodus 20. I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's the Mosaic covenant. It starts with historical prologue. Abraham says, well, how shall I know? And he has this elaborate ceremony, which you've probably thought about or heard in some of your classes before. He takes these animals, cuts them in half, lays them opposite each other so there's a pathway in between. And these animals, notice, a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle, and a young pigeon. Again, if you're an Israelite, and Moses has written this down years later, and you're reading this, and you know something about the Mosaic law already, you recognize, oh, these are all really familiar animals. These are all the animals that form the central place in the Mosaic sacrificial system. It didn't say go find a bear, a tiger, an ostrich. No, these are the animals. A heifer, a 3-year-old. That's what we'll find in Leviticus. A female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. These are the animals that will be part of the sacrificial system. There's promises here, you might say, by word and sacrament. How does God establish this covenant? Well, with words, I promise you things, and then with sacraments, with signs. This is what God does with covenants. There's an oath, and there's a ritual. There's a declaration, there's a demonstration. Again, even though as Protestants we don't think of marriage as technically a sacrament, it's a good example to understand that marriage has two parts. That there is a solemn oath, and then there is a ritual enactment. There are the vows to have and to hold from this day forward, to cherish the promises you make. That's the word, and then sacrament, quote unquote, small sacrament. The signification is the act of sexual union. That's the signing on the dotted line. That's the covenant ratification. And so here, when God meets Abraham, establishes a covenant, there's oath and ritual, there's word and sacrament. The birds of prey come down. It's always stumped commentators. Verse 11, I'm not positive what it means. Some say it shows how Abram didn't let distractions get in his way of worship. That's probably not it, but you can. I'd like to try it on my kids. Abram had birds of prey, and he's still focused. Others think the birds are symbolic of foreign nations, and Abram is keeping the promises of God safe from intruders and attackers because Abram drives them away. Others think they are a demonic attack. Maybe. I think it symbolizes, perhaps that's part of it, a spiritual attack, but also the trouble that Abram's offspring will face. So whatever it is, supernatural, natural, or some combination of the both, I think it's certainly an ominous sign that even as God is establishing this covenant, there are going to be attacks. So you see that they will be sojourners in the land for a long time, and then they will come back here, look at verse 16, in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. That's a really good verse 16, to tuck away somewhere in your apologetics memory bank. Because I'm sure you've thought before, and someone will ask you, what about the Canaanite genocide? What about later when God gives the promised land and they destroying these cities and slaughtering these nations. And yeah, that's hard to come to grips with. How do we explain that in a way that makes God good and just as he is? Well, verse 16 is one of the explanations for it. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In God's mind, why didn't he give Abraham the land right now? Why would they have to go into Egypt and be slaves for 400 years? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that in redemptive history, but one of the reasons is like the sins of the Amorites. God has some, in his own sovereignty, he has some kind of, bucket of iniquity. And he's just waiting. And the Amorites just keep pouring and pouring. He says, not yet. Not yet. Not yet. So when God gave the promised land, because that's what he's talking about, these Amorite people, these Canaanite people. When God gave the promised land, he was just because he had waited for centuries until their sins were so grievous that he was justified in punishing them, in overthrowing their cities and their land. Again, it doesn't answer every existential question, but it is an important verse to understand. God deals with the nations. It wasn't a whim. He didn't give them the land now. No, Abraham, they're not wicked enough that they deserve to be punished quite yet. And so he waits. It's also a warning, because if he has that with the Amorites, does he have it with China? Does he have it with the United States? He still judges the nations and patiently waits as the sins pile up, so that when God does throw down kings and kingdoms, he's always just in doing so. He's always just, having waited. This Hittite covenant ritual stands behind this act here. One of the covenant rituals among the Hittites says this, quote, "If the troops have been beaten by the enemy, they perform a ritual behind the river as follows. They cut through a man, a goat, a puppy, and a little pig." I'm sorry, the Hittites. "They place half on this side and half on that side, and in front of them they make a gate of wood and stretch over it. And in front of the gate they light fires on this side and on that, and the troops walk right through, and then they come to the river, they sprinkle water over them." Another one of these rituals says, "Abram placed himself under oath to Iralim and had cut the neck of the sheep, saying, 'Let me so die if I take back that which I have given thee.'" I think you can understand what is the import of this covenant ceremony, where we get the image, the language of cutting a covenant. They were literally cutting a covenant, and the image was to convey, as these animals are torn limb from limb, so may it fall on me, should I fail to keep my end of this covenant arrangement. That's the significance of these animals being torn side from side, limb from limb. Keep your finger there and turn to Jeremiah, because this is, of course, centuries later, but the same kind of ritual is in play. Jeremiah 34, 18 through 20. If you're teaching Genesis 15 in a Bible study sometime and it gets very hard to dip into Hittite treaties, you can go to Jeremiah and you can explain this to them. Jeremiah 34, 18. "And the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land, who passed between the parts of the calf, and I will give them into the hands of their enemies, and into the hand of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds," there's birds, "of the air and the beasts of the earth." So clearly, the same basic ritual was in play centuries later. May it be to us. May you be torn limb from limb like these animals. That's the signification of passing through. It's a way it's an oath of self-malediction. May this curse come upon me. Now, you can understand that. But notice, Abram did not walk through the animals. Who went through the carcasses? Verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and flaming torch passed between these pieces. Normally, both parties of a covenant would pass through together, but this is obviously a theophany. Think about throughout Exodus, the people of Israel be led by a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. Smoke and fire, cloud and flame are the most common depictions of theophany in the Old Testament. That is a God appearing. So this smoking fire pot and flaming torch represents God himself. God, in other words, is taking full responsibility for these promises. Abram is not under obligation to ensure the realization of these promises. As I said the first week, we'll come back time and again to this question of, is the covenant here conditional or unconditional? And it depends on how we're using the words. We want to say, on the one hand, unconditional, meaning the fulfillment of it does not depend upon Abraham. The Lord will fulfill the promises. However, we should say there are conditions. The condition is the faith of the beneficiaries of the promises. So to say that the covenant is conditional is not, so this does not equal meritorious in any way. So a very simple example, if I don't even know what concerts kids these days. Let's see, my son went to, several months ago, my two sons went to the John Mayer concert up at the Spectrum. Oh yeah, it was the very back row. I said, don't mention Taylor Swift. So they went and they needed a ticket, cost money. So there is a condition to enter into the concert. No ticket, no entry. So we might think condition, but condition does not establish how one is to receive the ticket. Could be that they worked really hard and saved all their money and earned to purchase a ticket to go to the concert. They merited it. Or it could be that a very indulgent father paid for their ticket and allowed them to go from his own unilateral grace and benevolent favor. You can think for yourself which scenario it was. So to say that the Abrahamic covenant or the covenant of grace is conditional is not to say that we as the beneficiaries merit it, but there are conditions to be met. Now, on one sense, all of the conditions you could say, are met by the covenant-keeping Messiah. On the other hand, you could say that this condition of faith is the instrumental way we receive, but that faith too is a unilateral gift. That faith is sovereignly implanted in us. So even that faith has no meritorious weight to it. So unconditional, if we want to, I get why we want to say that word to stress that it's all of God, and yet there are conditions, strictly speaking. Here's what Meredith Kline says about this scene in Genesis 15. Graphically symbolized by the slain and halved animals soon to be consumed by the birds of prey was the curse of death, violent and forsaken. To pass through the way between the rows of severed carcasses was to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It does give some new image to that metaphor. The frightful horror of this death curse was overwhelmingly communicated to Abraham, and his experience of the abyss of sleep and the terrors of unnatural darkness. Such was the malediction that the Lord conditionally invoked upon himself. Covenant introduction, covenant ratification. Next is the covenant signification with the sign of circumcision. So let's take a 5-minute break, and we will start back up at 7 o'clock. All right, let's get back, and I'm going to go about 35 minutes and then turn it over to David for the last bit of the class. We'll see if we can get through this third section from Genesis chapter 17. So turn there. The covenant is clearly the central issue in Genesis 17. The word berith, covenant, occurs 13 times in 9 different verses. What was the nature of this covenant? Let me give you 7 statements. So 7 statements or 7 things about this covenant here. Number 1, the covenant in chapter 17 builds upon the covenant we saw in chapter 15. So we read in verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. We've heard that promise before. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. If we had time, I'd read the whole chapter, but we'll refer to other parts of it. So the first statement, this covenant builds upon the covenant we saw in chapter 15. The first one stressed the land. This iteration stresses the multitude of descendants. Nehemiah, chapter 9, treats both aspects of part of the same covenant. Nehemiah 9, 7, and 8, you are the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you. You made with him the covenant to give his offspring the land of the Canaanites. So we don't want to see 12, 15, 17, all doing different things. Nehemiah later understands this is part of the same covenant. That's why chapter 15 is this ratification. Now we have the sign that goes with it. So it builds upon what we've seen. Statement number 2. The stipulations of the covenant call upon Abraham to walk with God. You might think, how can God's promise be indestructible and completely dependent on God's own initiative if the fulfillment of that promise requires something from human beings? Right? In verse 1, walk before me and be blameless. Well, we should not think that God chooses us, saves us, and then there's nothing to do. We don't stop at justification. We go on to sanctification. And here we have the fundamental covenant obligation. If you wanted to boil down the covenant obligation into one pregnant phrase, it would be that. Walk before me. Remember last week's lecture, where have we seen that? And Esau walked with God. That is the designation of loyalty to a king. Walk before me and be blameless, not here meaning sinless, but a life of integrity, uprightness. Job, it was said, is a blameless man in all the earth. And we notice that Abraham did as he was told on that very day. He went with great pain to himself and to others. I won't belabor the point, but circumcision for grown men must have been painful. So this sounds like a funny quip. I don't mean it to be funny, but whatever God is calling you to do today in obedience to him, it is likely not as painful as Abraham and his men being circumcised on that day. It was a costly obedience. Walk with God. Statement number 3. God promised 3 things. So he promised land, that was pronounced in chapter 15. And here again, we see it, verse 9, as for you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring, that you keep between you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. He who is 8 days old shall be circumcised. Everyone born in your house shall be circumcised. Goes on to tell Sarai what to do. Even, verse 27, all the foreigners in their house. So this is for all sorts of people, as we'll see in a moment. And the promise for them, back up in verse 8, I will give you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan. So there's land, and there's offspring. We see that plainly. We've seen it already. Your descendants will be as the stars of the sky. So in verse 8, I will give to you and your offspring this land. So you got a promised land, you have a promised seed, and then the end of verse 8, don't miss the Lord's presence. So you figure out how to get it all into P words. Promised land, progeny, presence. There's probably some other good ways to do it. Land, offspring, in God's presence. That last one, I will be their God, is the covenant promise distilled into one sentence, and we will come back to it again and again in this class. And we will, Lord willing, at the very end, we'll see in Revelation how this is the final, ultimate climax of God's redemptive plan. That I will be a God to you, and you will be my people, and I will be your God. So this was not simply about a land in the Middle East and about offspring, but it was about the deepest, final, fullest spiritual realities. I will be with you, and I will be your God. 4th statement. The covenant was made with Abraham and his offspring. 6 times we have the language in this chapter, and your seed after you, or and your offspring after you. Verses 10 through 12, those yous are plural, y'alls. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you, except for that, you and your offspring after you. These other ones are plural yous. You shall be circumcised in the flesh, the sign of a covenant between me and you. The obligations, in other words, are for the whole household. The promises are for the whole household. The identification is for the whole household. So clearly, this covenant is not made with only an individual, but with his offspring, with this plural, this household. God makes covenants with households. I know my Baptist friends, you're nervous. But it's right. It's at least for now. Okay, we'll see what the new covenant does or doesn't do to that. But clearly, he's making a promise with households. Statement number 5. Circumcision was a sign of this covenant. Sometimes it is called the covenant. Jesus says this cup is the new covenant in my blood. So sometimes circumcision is just called, that is shorthand for the covenant. It is verse 11, it is a sign. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Circumcision pointed to a cutting off of the old man, a removal of sinful flesh. And the witness of the Old Testament and the New Testament makes clear that circumcision was not just an ethnic boundary marker. It wasn't just a way of saying, you're a Jew, you're not a Jew. It was not just a physical demarcation. Bound up with circumcision were these deep spiritual realities. For example, Leviticus 26, 41 through 42. If then their uncircumcised hearts are humbled, they pay for their sin. I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and all your soul and live. Jeremiah 4:4. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Circumcise your hearts, or my wrath will break out. So circumcision of the foreskin of the male member is representative of what should be the corresponding circumcision, cutting away the hardness of the human heart. The New Testament confirms this was not merely a figurative use of the word that developed later in the history of Israel. Not just, that we know we do circumcision, the physical thing, but now we use it as kind of a metaphor for spiritual things. Maybe they read into it, but that's not what it meant as a covenant sign. No, that won't do, because that's not how the New Testament understands it. Romans 2, 28 through 29. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. That's an audacious statement. If Paul wrote that today, he would surely be called anti-Jew in making that statement. Now, we can use the term Jew in different ways as a national identity, an ethnic identity, but in its fullest spiritual identity, what Paul is saying here is, no, you're not a Jew because you have the right ethnic lineage. To be a real Jew is a matter of the heart, and he calls it circumcision. So he links the inward renewal of the heart with circumcision. Now, even more importantly, Romans 4, 11 and 12. And he received the sign of circumcision, talking about Abraham, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that the righteousness might be credited to them. That may be the most important verse, I think, for understanding the connection between circumcision and baptism. At least for understanding what circumcision meant, because you get the language sign and seal, familiar language about covenants, and also the sacraments are signs and seals. Well, that's here from Romans 4:11. The sign of circumcision, what was circumcision? A seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while uncircumcised. So if you were to, Paul's inspired, Paul's right. So if you were asking Abraham, and he had good Pauline theology, so you were circumcised, Abraham, right? Yeah. And were you circumcised after you believed? Yes, after I believed. Well, what was that circumcision? Well, it was a seal of the righteousness that comes by faith. It was a seal that my heart had been cut away with the foreskin of the flesh. It pointed to my relationship with God, that I was with God and he was my God. It pointed to my forgiveness. It pointed to my cleansing from sin. Okay, yeah, you're right, Abraham. But Abraham, how could you give that sign that meant all of those spiritual blessings and you give it to your 8-day-old son? Isn't that a mistake? And Abraham would say, God told me to. So, we won't go all the way in to an ecclesiology and sacraments class, but there must be a way in which circumcision, which Paul says means all of those things to Abraham. God's not inconsistent. That God then, okay, now I want you to give the sign. It means all of those realities. Justification, union with God, forgiveness, blessing, all of this. And you're going to give it to your 8-day-old son. It still means all of that. So there must be a way that it can be given, circumcision could be given to some in anticipation of those things, or in hope of those things, or praying that they would live out the reality of all those things. So there's different ways to explain it, or language, but it's all getting at the same idea. There is a way to be in the covenant, you might say, in an external connection, and a way to be in the covenant internally. Or what was the language you were saying, Johannes?
Organic versus...
Yeah, like legal versus organic. There's lots of different categories for it. Legally, you're bound up in this covenant. Organically, you may or may not have all of those covenant realities. Circumcision pointed to blessings for the covenant keeper and curses to the covenant breaker. May you be cut off if you prove to be a covenant breaker, just as the foreskin of your flesh. So you see how the symbolism went both ways? Positively, it pointed to the cutting away, the regeneration of the heart. Negatively, just as your foreskin is cut off, you will be cut off if you've proved to be a covenant breaker. In the same way, the waters of baptism, major key, the waters represent the cleansing, washing away of sin. Minor key, it's also a flood of judgment, should you prove to be a covenant breaker. So, we see circumcision was a sign of the covenant. You see, look at verse 14, back in Genesis 17. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Probably a play on words. Whoever is not cut off in the flesh will be cut off from his people. So God gave this rich spiritual right to Abraham upon faith, and then to his children upon being born into a household of faith. Ishmael would not be a part of the chosen promised line, but the spiritual realities were marked out in circumcision. The sign marked out the family as followers of Yahweh. Think of Joshua. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. That didn't mean that all of Joshua's household was saved as we think of, do you have a personal relationship with Yahweh and what do you... It meant that they were all under the covenant obligations of this covenant Lord. Of course, it would not make sense that within your household you would have some people with another covenant Lord and some with a different one. Ephesians 6:1 is another one of those verses that I like to bring out when I explain infant baptism. I say, well, what's the connection there? Well, Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. In the Lord. He's talking to children in a church context, certainly some of whom are, very young. They're still under their parents' authority. But he says, you obey your parents, not just as an aspect of, well, they're in authority. You obey them in the Lord. In other words, even as children here, Paul doesn't treat the children in that covenant community, writing to the Ephesians, as, to put it in Old Testament terms, he doesn't treat them as Amorites and Hittites and Jebusites. He addresses them as Israelites. You too have Christ as your covenant Lord, and so you must obey him in the Lord. So quickly then, and then we'll give some time to David. That was number 5, that circumcision is the sign of the covenant. Number 6, notice this was never just a Jewish covenant. Now, largely so, but not exclusively so. Verse 12, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Verse 27, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. From the very beginning, this was not strictly an ethnic covenant. It was not strictly a national covenant. True, it certainly became associated with the Jews, and the Jews could use it as a sign of ethnic pride. But from the very establishment of this Abrahamic covenant, there was a provision. You can be a foreigner to the line of Shem, to the line of Abraham, and you can still get in on this. You will still have the same sign applied. It was never just a Jewish covenant. Statement number 7, it is an everlasting covenant. We see that several times. Everlasting, now it's true in the Old Testament, everlasting doesn't always mean to infinity and beyond. It can mean a long, long time. Circumcision is no longer the sign of this covenant. 1 Corinthians 7, Galatians 5, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, Paul says. So you could say, wait a minute, I thought this was an everlasting covenant. Well, again, you could understand everlasting to mean very long time, or if you do take it to mean it never ends, there's still a right way to understand. Even though the covenant's signification has changed, the covenant has not. The covenant promise has not. The Abrahamic covenant has not been abolished. So another key verse is Galatians 3:17. The law, here's Paul, Galatians 3:17, the law which came 430 years afterward does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. We'll have many more occasions to say this, but the new covenant is new relative to the Mosaic covenant. It's not new in replacing the Abrahamic covenant. In fact, I'll make the case when we get there. I think the new covenant is largely the Abrahamic covenant in fuller, clearer bloom. That what is new about the new covenant is the crispness and the clarity. It is new in its degree, but it's not new in its very essence. So the new covenant, Paul says, does not replace this covenant of promise with Abraham. So however you understand the sacrament of baptism, we have to allow this Abrahamic covenant has not been annulled. So why is this still good news for us? Let me just give you a few points and then we'll have David come up. So why is this covenant of circumcision still good news? Number one, because God still deals with us as families. Acts 2:39, Peter says, the promise is for you and for your children and for all those who are far off. I don't think I know that's a classic Paedo-Baptist proof text, but I think for good reason. Genesis 17 says over and over again, you and your children after you, you and your children after you. Everyone would have, it's like if, someone says to an American, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You think, okay, I've heard something about that before, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if somebody said, the inalienable right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and scratch-off tickets, or whatever, you'd say, that was a different one. That was very familiar, and then something got tweaked. So when Peter says the promise is for you, yes, and for your children, we've heard that covenant language, and for all who are far off. So now saying the Gentiles have a way, a new open door. There was always there, a foreigner born in your household, purchased. Now there's a wide open door. So he repeats, obviously, this covenant language, the promises for you and for your children. And yes, it's I understand the Baptist, Paedo-Baptist back and forth. I have lots of good Baptist friends, and their argument is, where do you see infant baptism in the New Testament? I say, well, there are household baptisms, which at least show that God deals with families. And I'd say I can make a better case for infant baptism than infant dedication, but that's a different question. And I do have some good friends who say, yeah, no, you're right, and we don't do infant dedication. It's like, infant baptism without the water, and so we're not doing that. I respect them for it. But I would say, what would you expect after centuries and millennia, promises for you and your children, you and your children, you and your children? Now we have a new covenant. It's more gracious, it's more expansive, it's better, it's clearer. No more kids. I know it's an argument from silence, but I think there's a burden of proof in the other direction to say, with all the controversies, there's a huge controversy over circumcision. They're really struggling. We do circumcision, and now Paul's saying, circumcision, take it or leave it. Wow, that's a food laws. We do food laws. No, you decide. That's a big deal. If all of a sudden they said, you know what, kids, not a part of the covenant, I would expect some explosion of controversy like there is around these other Jewish markers which are going by the wayside. The analogy I sometimes use, if our HR director comes to our staff and says, we have a new insurance policy. It's a great insurance policy. It's way better than the one we had last year. Okay, you get better coverage, you got lower premiums, lower out-of-pocket, you can get all the surgeries you want. Elective surgery, this is an amazing, better insurance plan in every way. By the way, your kids they don't count in the insurance plan anymore. No one would think that was a better insurance plan. There would be a great riot among the staff to say, you can't do that. We have counted on to be under this. Our whole family gets to be a part of this, and now you're saying it's so good, it's so much better that the children, they have to find their own insurance. I guess the analogy isn't perfect, and I'm not using insurance there as eternal security. I'm just saying blessing, covenant blessing. The blessing, okay? So not everyone who is a member of the covenant has that same relationship with God, but they all enjoyed the temporal blessings. Land, family, protection, they all, that was a part of, that was being in the covenant community, that God deals with families. Second, God still calls us to walk with Him. The two commands to Abraham basically meant live your life in a way pleasing to God. Give yourself to God unreservedly. Walk before me, walk with me. So again, yes, we need commandments, we need laws, we need specifications, but this image is so powerful. Yeah. You want to explain to your kids, what does it mean to be a Christian? Walk with God, like a sheep following a shepherd, like an athlete listening to his coach, like Jesus calling the disciples, like a child holding his parent's hand. Hey, we're going to cross the street now. Your kids reach up and hold your hand because there's cars here, and you're walking across the street. And you love them and they love you, and if they know what's good and they trust you, they willingly grab that hand. Walk with me. Let me walk with you, Daddy. Let me go across this road. That's what it means. Be mine, and I will be yours. That's the covenant arrangement. And then third, finally, God still promises us his presence. That is the promise of promises. When God promises to deliver his people from Egypt, he says in Exodus 6:7, I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Later, in confirming the Mosaic covenant, Leviticus 26:12, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Facing captivity in Babylon, God tells them, Jeremiah 24:7, I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Several times in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, in Revelation, at the heart of the Abrahamic covenant is the Emmanuel promise. God with us. So if they had covenant ears, and they heard the word prophesied in Isaiah 7 and then in Matthew chapter 1, thought this is what our whole history has been about. And I will be with you. And now not just prefigured, not just in a land, not just with a tabernacle and a temple, but the God-man, Emmanuel, God with us, is the fulfillment of all that the covenant promises had been anticipating. And we will then, with unveiled face, enjoy that vision and that presence on the other side of our Jordan River in Canaan for all eternity. That's our covenant hope.